Valeria Reyes was 16 when the world still seemed understandable to her. She lived in the northern part of Monterrey, in a neighborhood of tightly packed houses where children played on the sidewalks until the heat overwhelmed them and their mothers called them in from the windows. She was the second daughter of Don Ernesto, a shift worker at an auto parts assembly plant, and Doña Carmen, who made tamales on weekends to sell on the corner and supplement the family income. Life in that house was decent, though cramped, with the television on after 8 o'clock and the smell of beans permeating the walls. Valeria was discreet to the point of being unnoticeable. Her teachers would later remember her as a quiet student with no major problems or achievements to speak of. Her high school classmates described her as someone who smiled but rarely opened up, who was present but always a little on the sidelines of the group. She wasn't exactly unhappy. Rather, she was a girl who inhabited her own solitude with a resignation that no one had thought to question. She had an old phone that her older cousin had given her when she upgraded to a new model. It was a slow device, with a scratched screen in one corner, but it was enough for Valeria to listen to music with headphones on her way to school and to check, from time to time, the social networks that her classmates used with a naturalness that she found difficult to imitate. It was through a messaging app, one of those that proliferated in the years when teenagers began to build parallel worlds on their screens, that she received a message from a stranger one Tuesday in September. The profile name was Rodrigo. The photo showed a man with pleasant features, a calculated smile, and a carefree attitude that Valeria failed to read for what it was. A construct. He wrote to her with the ease of someone who had been practicing this type of introduction for a long time. He asked her name. He told her he had seen her in a mutual group. He made her feel that it was her, specifically her, who had caught his attention among many others. Valeria replied that same afternoon. Rodrigo Saavedra was 23 years old, although he sometimes said 22 to close the distance. He was originally from Saltillo, but had been moving between cities in the northeast of the country for several years without a clear direction or a steady job. He had a minor criminal record, nothing that would have kept him in jail for long, and a remarkable ability to appear likable to those who needed to believe him. He knew the language teenagers use. He knew when to push and when to back off. And he had a network of people, young men and women, who functioned as a system with no name or visible structure. During the first few weeks, the messages between Rodrigo and Valeria were what any girl her age would have recognized as romantic attention. He asked her about her day, sent her memes, told her she was different from the others, with that worn-out phrase that nevertheless continued to work in the mouths of those who uttered it with conviction. Valeria began to wait for his messages. She began to look for them. In the small space of the room she shared with her younger sister, she began to construct an image of this man that had little to do with reality. If Don Ernesto had known, he would have intervened. But Valeria said nothing, not out of malice, but because she had not learned that such conversations could be shared. In her home, boyfriends and feelings were not discussed so easily. There was affection, yes, but of the silent kind. The kind that is expressed by putting the plate on the table or waiting awake until the other person arrives. The big words were kept to themselves. One Sunday in October, Rodrigo asked her to meet him. He told her that he wanted to really get to know her, that messages were no longer enough for him. Valeria hesitated for 3 days before saying yes. They met at a shopping mall downtown, had a soda, and walked for almost 2 hours. Rodrigo was charming. He knew how to ask questions. He knew when to be quiet. He knew how to make her laugh twice, with stories that were probably not entirely true. That night, Valeria came home before 9. Doña Carmen didn't notice anything different in her expression. Don Ernesto was watching the game. No one knew that that afternoon had marked the beginning of what would eventually become that family's worst nightmare. The following encounters became routine before Valeria could recognize them as such. Rodrigo showed up when he said he would, which she, without knowing it, had already begun to consider a virtue. He brought her small gifts: candy, a 10-peso bracelet, a song he had sent her with the message, "Listen to this and think of you." Valeria received them with a mixture of gratitude and strangeness, like someone who is not used to being seen and does not know what to do when someone looks at her. In November, Rodrigo told her he loved her. Valeria didn't respond right away, but that night she couldn't sleep. What came next was gradual, almost imperceptible. Rodrigo started asking questions about her friends, her schedule, what she did when she wasn't with him. At first, they sounded like genuine interest. Then, they started to sound like something else. When Valeria mentioned that she was going out on Saturday with some friends from school, Rodrigo was silent for a moment and then said, with a calmness that was more uncomfortable than shouting, "I thought that day was for us." Valeria canceled her plans with her friends. This happened 3 times before her friends stopped inviting her. In December, Rodrigo introduced her to part of his circle. They were young people between the ages of 18 and 26, 2 men and a girl named Fernanda, who had a blank stare and barely spoke all afternoon. Valeria didn't feel comfortable, but she couldn't say why. Rodrigo told her later that Fernanda was shy, that the others were good people, that she should trust her judgment more. Valeria began to trust her judgment. In January, Don Ernesto found his daughter crying in the bathroom one Monday night. When he asked her what was wrong, she said nothing, that it was school. He believed her because he wanted to believe her, because the alternative was harder to bear. Doña Carmen mentioned to a neighbor that week that Valeria was acting strange, quieter than usual. The neighbor said it was just a phase. It was in February when Rodrigo first suggested the idea of running away together. He presented it as an adventure, as proof that what they had was real. He told her they would leave for a few days, that they would return before anyone noticed, that this way they would know for sure if they were meant for each other. Valeria asked him where they would go. Rodrigo smiled and told her it was a surprise. On February 14th, while Doña Carmen was preparing dinner and Don Ernesto was returning from his afternoon shift, Valeria took a small backpack with clothes for 2 days, left her room tidy as she always did, and walked out the back door of the house. She left no note. Rodrigo was waiting for her 2 blocks away in a gray car Valeria had never seen before, with Fernanda in the passenger seat and one of the men, a burly guy everyone called El Gato, behind the wheel. Valeria got into the back seat. El Gato drove off without saying a word. Rodrigo took her hand and told her everything would be all right. They left Monterrey on the old highway, heading south. That same night, Don Ernesto knocked on Valeria's door to call her to dinner. It took him several minutes to accept that no one was inside. He checked the entire house before calling his daughter's cell phone. The phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail. He tried 4 more times. Then he sat down in the kitchen chair and told his wife, in a voice she had never heard before, that Valeria was gone. At 11 o'clock that night, Don Ernesto was at the public prosecutor's office, filing a missing person report. The officer on duty told him that in cases of minors who leave voluntarily, he had to wait 72 hours. Don Ernesto put his hands on the desk and said that his daughter had not left voluntarily. The officer repeated the procedure. Don Ernesto went out into the street and began to look for her on his own. On the first day, Valeria still believed it was an adventure. They stayed in a roadside hotel room on the outskirts of a town with no significant name, one of those that exist between big cities and that no one remembers passing through. The room had 2 beds, an old television, and a window overlooking a gravel parking lot. Rodrigo was attentive that first night. He bought her a quesadilla from a nearby stand, told her she was beautiful, and promised her that the next day they would continue on to a better place. The next day, they didn't go anywhere better. Rodrigo left early with Gato and Fernanda. He told Valeria to wait, that they wouldn't be long. They were gone for 6 hours. When they returned, they brought an unknown man with them. Rodrigo didn't introduce him. He told Valeria, with a calmness that no longer sounded like tranquility but something else, that they needed money to continue their journey and that she was going to help. Valeria didn't understand right away. When she did understand, she said no. Rodrigo didn't raise his voice. That was the most disconcerting thing. He explained slowly and precisely what would happen if she refused. He told her that no one knew where she was. He told her that if she tried to contact anyone, the consequences would be for her family, not for her. He told her all this while looking her in the eyes and without changing his expression. That night, Valeria did what they asked her to do. What followed was a routine that the group administered with an efficiency that spoke of practice. Fernanda acted as an intermediary and watchdog. El Gato handled the contacts. A third man, who appeared on the third day and was called El Primo, was in charge of the financial arrangements. Rodrigo supervised everything from a distance that allowed him to avoid getting his hands visibly dirty, although his hands had been dirty for a long time. Valeria was subjected to forced servitude that the group disguised as debt. They told her that the room, the food, the transportation, everything had a cost that she had to pay off. The arithmetic was designed so that it would never add up. On the 10th day, Valeria found a moment when Fernanda fell asleep and her phone was nearby. She dialed her home number. It rang twice. Doña Carmen answered. Valeria managed to say "Mom" before Fernanda woke up and snatched the phone from her hands. What followed was a brief but systematic beating, the first of many. Doña Carmen heard that single word and began to scream her daughter's name until the line went dead. Don Ernesto, who had been traveling around neighborhoods for 10 days with a photo printed on bond paper, received the news that his daughter had called. They went to the public prosecutor's office that same afternoon with the information. The agent took note. He said they would make inquiries. He said they would call him. They did not call him that week. The group moved on. It was part of the pattern. Never stay more than 10 or 12 days in the same place. They moved Valeria to the back seat of the car, with precise instructions on what she should and should not do if anyone saw her. They arrived at a neighborhood on the outskirts of another city, an interior room with no windows to the outside, with a lock that could only be opened from the outside. There, surveillance intensified. It was no longer just Fernanda. The men took turns. Valeria was given 1 meal a day, sometimes 2 if the group had had a good day. They had taken away any objects she could use to communicate or harm herself. She slept on a thin mattress on the floor. One afternoon, while El Gato was sleeping in the chair in front of the door, Valeria found a piece of pencil in the cracks in the floor. She wrote on the back of a cookie wrapper, "My name is Valeria Reyes. I am being held captive. Please notify Ernesto Reyes in Monterrey." She folded the paper as small as she could and hid it inside the hem of her sweatshirt. She was never able to give it to anyone, but something happened that the group hadn't counted on. One of the men who had been with Valeria in the early days had said too much to an acquaintance. Days later, that acquaintance mentioned something vague to someone else. The chain of communication was imprecise and full of gaps, but it eventually reached the ears of a municipal police officer who had Valeria's name on a list of missing minors that had been circulated from Monterrey. The police officer made a call. The call first went to the wrong desk, and then to the right one, 4 days late. Don Ernesto received the call on a Thursday morning. He was told that there were indications that his daughter might be in a certain area, that they were following the lead, and that he should not go ahead. Don Ernesto hung up, took his keys, and set off alone for that city because he didn't know what else to do. What he didn't know was that by the time he arrived, the group would have already found out that someone was asking about them, and that Rodrigo, upon hearing this, had said something that Fernanda would later repeat to the investigators in the monotonous voice of someone reciting something they had heard many times before. If it's not mine, it's no one's. Rodrigo was not a man who lost control easily. That was precisely what made him more dangerous than the others. El Gato hit people when he got angry. El Primo shouted. Rodrigo, on the other hand, became quieter, colder, as if anger lowered his temperature instead of raising it. When he found out that someone was asking questions in the area, he didn't break anything. He didn't raise his voice. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor for several minutes. Then he looked at Valeria, who was curled up on her mattress against the wall, and said with a calmness that froze the entire room, "Do you know anything about this?" Valeria said no. He studied her for a few more seconds and then left without closing the door. Fernanda entered in his place and locked the door. What happened over the next 3 days was an escalation that the group carried out as if there were an established protocol for such moments. The food ration disappeared completely on the first day. On the second day, the interrogations began. Who knew where he was, what he had said, who he had contacted? Valeria replied that she hadn't contacted anyone, that she didn't know anything, that she hadn't done anything. The answers didn't matter. The questions were the pretext, not the reason. El Primo was the first to hit her with the intention of causing real harm. He punched her in the side, leaving her breathless for almost a minute. Fernanda watched from the doorway without intervening. El Gato arrived later and continued where the other had left off. Rodrigo entered last, when the two men had already finished, and knelt in front of Valeria, who was on the floor. He spoke to her softly. He told her that all of this was her fault, that if she had been obedient, if she had understood from the beginning how things worked, none of this would have been necessary. He told her that he loved her, that had never changed, but that love had conditions like everything else in life. Valeria didn't respond. Her eyes were closed and she was breathing heavily. Rodrigo took her chin and lifted her face. "If she's not mine," he said slowly, separating each word. "She's no one's." Then he stood up and left. That night, Fernanda brought him water and a piece of bread. She left it on the floor without saying anything. It took Valeria a long time to move to reach it. She had a deep pain in her ribs that intensified with each breath, and a ringing in her right ear that would not go away for days. She ate the bread slowly, her back against the cold wall, staring at the yellow light bulb hanging from the ceiling, without a shade. She thought of her father, of the chair in the kitchen where he used to sit and read the newspaper on Sundays, of the smell of coffee that filled the house in the mornings. She thought of these things with deliberate concentration, as if clinging to concrete images could protect her from her surroundings. On the third day, Rodrigo made a decision that the group accepted without question. They would move that same night. They had a contact in another city, several hours away. Valeria would travel with them. It was not an option. They put her in the car after midnight, her hands tied with a plastic strip and a sweatshirt over her, so that if anyone looked through the window, she would appear to be asleep. El Gato drove. El Primo sat in the front. Rodrigo and Fernanda flanked Valeria in the back seat. They took a secondary road, without lights, heading north. Valeria looked out the window at the shadows of the passing trees. She tried to memorize signs, names of towns, road junctions. She repeated the numbers on a license plate she saw at a toll booth in her mind. She remained the quiet girl that no one had thought to look at closely, but now that same invisibility was all she had left. The car accelerated, and darkness closed in around the road. They arrived at dawn at a warehouse on the outskirts of an industrial town, one of those places where trucks spend the night and no one asks about the noise. The place smelled of old oil and moisture that had accumulated over the years. There was a room at the back, separated from the rest by a metal door, with a cot without a mattress and a light bulb that flickered every time someone stomped. That's where they left Valeria. The days that followed were the worst. The chain of violence that the group had started weeks earlier intensified without any justification, not even the pretext of punishment or warning. It was something different. It was the exercise of harm as a routine, as a way to occupy time, as a demonstration of power that needed to be constantly reaffirmed because, deep down, it was fragile. El Primo burned her forearm with a lighter one afternoon for no apparent reason. El Gato forced her to stand for hours until her knees gave way. Fernanda, who at one point had seemed the least cruel of the group, began to participate with an indifference that was almost more disturbing than the men's sadism. Rodrigo remained the most calculating. He would come in, observe, give instructions, and leave. Valeria had stopped trying to reason with them. She had also stopped crying, not because the pain had lessened, but because the body reaches certain limits where ordinary response mechanisms are suspended and only a minimal, almost animalistic form of presence remains, focused solely on survival. It was a Wednesday, according to what investigators would later reconstruct from cross-checked testimonies. Rodrigo had left early and did not return until the afternoon. He brought alcohol and attention that the others recognized immediately because they knew how to read him better than anyone else. Something had gone wrong outside that warehouse, although no one in the group would speak clearly about what it was. What did happen was that night, the violence reached a magnitude unlike anything before. Valeria was beaten, fracturing 2 ribs. She lay on the floor of the tin room, unable to get up. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. El Gato said she was exaggerating. El Primo shrugged. Rodrigo looked at her from the doorway for a few seconds, then turned off the light and closed the door. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, Valeria Reyes stopped breathing. She was 16 years old. When the group discovered her, they did not panic, but instead activated an operational coldness that revealed that, on some level, they had always contemplated this possibility. Rodrigo gave precise instructions. No one raised their voice. Fernanda collected Valeria's belongings with an efficiency that, decades later, would still be difficult to understand for those who read the file. They left the warehouse before dawn. They drove for almost 2 hours on a secondary road until they reached a vacant lot on the edge of a communal farm where El Gato knew someone who wouldn't ask questions. They had shovels, a mixing bucket, and several sacks of powdered cement that they had been carrying in the trunk for days, as if they had planned this moment, or as if they had learned from a previous case that foresight was necessary. They dug a hole in the loose earth behind an abandoned block structure. They put Valeria inside. They poured the cement on top. Rodrigo was the last to leave the site. According to Fernanda, who testified months later with her gaze fixed on the table in front of her, he said nothing as he did so. He just wiped his hands on his pants and walked back to the car. The sun was beginning to rise when they took the road back. El Gato turned on the radio. No one spoke during the journey. At that same time, Don Ernesto Reyes was getting up in the city where he had been searching for his daughter for days, checking the photos on his phone for the 100th time, preparing for another day of unanswered questions. He drank his coffee standing up, as usual, looking out the window at the street that was still dark. He didn't know that there was nothing left to find alive. All that remained was to find her. The thread that set everything in motion was not a voluntary confession or a police mistake corrected in time. It was a late-night conversation between El Primo and a woman he shouldn't have sought out that night. Primo had an ex-partner in the city, a woman named Graciela, who had known him since before he got involved with Rodrigo's group. He arrived at her door drunk and upset, several days after what had happened on the common land. Graciela let him in because she was afraid not to. During the hours that followed, Primo talked more than he had in months. He didn't say everything, but he said enough. He mentioned a girl. He mentioned cement. He mentioned that Rodrigo had said no one would find her. Graciela didn't sleep that night. The next morning, when El Primo left, she took her phone and dialed the anonymous tip line number she had seen posted at a bus stop weeks earlier. She spoke for 4 minutes. She gave names. She gave the name of the ejito that Primo had mentioned without realizing it. The call went to an agent at the state prosecutor's office who had, among dozens of other files on his desk, the missing persons report for Valeria Reyes, 16 years old, originally from Monterrey, who had been missing for 73 days. That afternoon, a search team was formed. Don Ernesto found out through a call he received while eating something he didn't know what it was. They told him there was a concrete lead, that they were working on it, and that he should please not show up at the location so as not to hinder the operation. He hung up the phone and remained motionless for several minutes. Then he called his wife. Doña Carmen answered on the first ring, as she had answered every call for more than 2 months. He didn't tell her it was good news. He didn't know yet. The team arrived at the communal land with trained dogs and forensic location equipment. The abandoned block structure was exactly where the anonymous description had indicated. The dogs pointed to the area behind it before the technicians deployed their instruments. The earth at that point had a different density. Someone had recently disturbed it. It took them 3 hours to reach Valeria. The forensic report would later establish that the remains showed evidence of multiple trauma, consistent with repeated blows over a prolonged period. It would also establish the cause of death and the approximate date of death. What the report could not establish, because no document has that capacity, was the specific weight of what Don Ernesto felt when an agent came out from behind that structure and walked toward him, who had arrived at the scene disobeying the instruction not to show up, and told him what he had to say. Ernesto did not scream. He sat down on the ground, on the dry earth of the communal land, and remained silent for a long time. The arrests took place in the following days. El Gato was the first, located at a bus terminal with a ticket purchased under a false name. El Primo was arrested at Graciela's house, who had asked her neighbors to let her stay with them while the situation was resolved. Fernanda turned herself in through a lawyer, 2 days after her photograph circulated in local media. Rodrigo was the last. He was found in a border town, in a hotel room paid for in cash, with a different haircut, and without the beard he had in the photographs that were circulating. What gave him away was a minor detail. He used once, either out of carelessness or arrogance, the same phone number he had used to contact Valeria months earlier. A single call. That was enough. He was arrested on a Tuesday morning without resistance. The trial lasted more than a year. The defense attorneys argued mitigating circumstances for each of the defendants. Vulnerable environments, absence of direct intent to cause death, diffuse responsibilities within the group. The judge listened to each argument with the patience required by the procedure. In the end, Rodrigo Saavedra was sentenced to 42 years in prison for intentional homicide, illegal deprivation of liberty, and human trafficking. El Gato and El Primo received 35 and 30 years, respectively. Fernanda, whose lawyer managed to partially prove her coercion within the group, received 18 years. None of the sentences brought anything back. Don Ernesto attended every hearing. He went alone, with a photograph of Valeria in the inside pocket of his jacket, one of those that bend with use and become soft around the edges. He never spoke to the media waiting for him outside. He never made any statements. Once, at the end of the last hearing, a journalist asked him how he felt. He paused for a moment, looked out onto the street, and said only that he wanted to go home. Doña Carmen had placed a candle on the kitchen windowsill the day Valeria disappeared. She kept it lit throughout the search, during the trial, and in the months that followed. One night, long after everything had ended in the way that these things end, it went out on its own. Doña Carmen never lit it again. Not because she had forgotten, but because there are ways of remembering that do not need fire to stay alive.